Lectures. Chapter 3. Race Differences in Cognitive Ability. Most people who call someone smart or bright or intelligent are talking about the quality that IQ tests measure. That quality is not virtue, merit, character, wisdom, or common sense. It is irrelevant to human worth. IQ denotes the mental agility that lets some people collate disparate bits of information and then infer and deduce from that information better than other people, whether the task is to decipher a corporate balance sheet, analyze Middlemarch, or determine why the car won't start. The quality measured by IQ tests assists people in figuring things out, both in their professions and in everyday life. More technically, IQ tests are the best measure of the general mental factor known as G, which in turn is the most rigorously investigated construct in psychology. One in a field riddled with fads that are enthusiastically accepted initially, but fail to pan out. Recall the claims once made for the importance of self-esteem and stereotype threat. Two, the major findings produced by IQ tests have been replicated time and again over decades, with different instruments for all kinds of populations tested in all kinds of conditions. The quantitative understanding of cognitive ability has the distinction of being at once a crowning achievement of psychology and widely criticized as pseudoscience. The charges of pseudoscience have many sources. 3. Some of these challenges need to be taken seriously. Is cognitive ability too complex to be represented by a single number? For some purposes, yes. For others, no. Are there multiple intelligences? There are certainly multiple talents, but it is possible to distinguish talents from cognitive ability both conceptually and statistically. 4. These and other questions are worth asking, and much has been learned from investigating them over the decades. But another source of resistance to accepting the validity of IQ tests is that the tests have persistently indicated different means and distributions of cognitive ability among races. Many people today consider this unacceptable, so unacceptable that it cannot possibly be true. And yet it is. I have 3 contentions to defend. When Africans, Asians, Europeans, and Latins take tests that are related to cognitive ability, their group results have different means. Race differences between Africans and Europeans in cognitive test scores narrowed significantly during the 1970s and 1980s, but the narrowing stopped 3 decades ago. Scores on today's most widely used standardized tests, whether they are tests of cognitive ability or academic achievement, pass the central test of fairness. They do not underpredict the performance of lower-scoring groups in the classroom or on the job. Each of these is a statement of fact. To understand the evidence for them, and why that evidence has been so strenuously resisted for so long, some historical context may be useful, including ways in which my own work has intersected with that history. A short history. Standardized tests with nationally representative samples didn't become part of the landscape until the second half of the 20th century, and even then only slowly. As of the end of the 1950s, many school systems administered standardized achievement tests, and many administered a written test of cognitive ability to 8th graders as a resource for their high school guidance counselors. Where I grew up, it wasn't called an IQ test, and students never learned their scores. The SAT was widely known, but only the small minority of high school seniors who wanted to go to a selective college needed to take it. Race differences in cognitive ability, which in America then meant the difference between Europeans and Africans, were not a major issue. Teachers in integrated schools in the North knew that African students on average didn't perform as well as European students in the classroom, but the magnitude of the national difference was open to argument. All of the existing studies of African test scores had used small samples or large but unrepresentative samples. Differences in classroom performance didn't necessarily mean much anyway. The great majority of African students were in segregated schools in the South. The accounts of terrible school facilities and inadequate schooling for African children in the South were familiar to everyone. So were the problems that existed in de facto segregated urban schools in the North. It was assumed that better education for African children would shrink the performance gap to insignificance. In 1960, the U.S. Office of Education sponsored a national survey known as Project Talent, intended to be the first scientifically planned national inventory of human talents, with a sample of 440,000 high school students. Assessing race differences had not been one of the goals of the project. It was then illegal to ask participants about their race, and the published results at the time did not mention any race differences. But information about race could be drawn from results in one-race schools which were then common, and further information was obtained through follow-up surveys in later years. All this indicated a large racial difference. Exactly how large is uncertain, but it was around the equivalent of 19 to 23 IQ points. 4 years later, Section 402 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 required the Commissioner of the Office of Education to conduct a survey concerning the lack of availability of equal educational opportunities for individuals by reason of race, color, religion, or national origin in public educational institutions. The sample was massive, 645,000 students in 4,000 schools. The report of the results, known as the Coleman Report after its principal investigator, the sociologist James S. Coleman, was submitted in July 1966. This was a pivotal event in social science, representing the first important use of multivariate regression, a technique that has since become the workhorse of quantitative economic and sociological analysis. The Coleman Report published the racial means on the study's cognitive test battery. Subsequent analyses refined the results, finding that the European-African difference was about 15 points for 9th graders and 18 points for 12th graders, but the size of the difference in test scores was ignored in the midst of the consternation created by the Coleman Report's central conclusion that the quality of a school played almost no role in explaining the performance of African students. This was heresy. The point of the survey had been to prove that poor education was to blame for the problems of African students, and better education would be the solution. But the Coleman Report found that the far more important factors were aspects of a student's family background. The Coleman Report had no effect on policy. Congress had already passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, a year before the report was released. But among those who read and understood its analysis, the results were portentous. If you believed the Coleman analysis, you had reason to be skeptical that improvements in schooling would close the European-African gap in test scores. For the rest of the 1960s and throughout the 1970s, race differences in cognitive ability were seldom part of the policy conversation. A notable exception was Arthur Jensen's 1969 article in the Harvard Educational Review, arguing that educational programs were unlikely to close the gap because it was substantially genetic. But that was followed in 1972 by Christopher Jenks's Inequality, a reassessment of the EFECT of family and schooling in America, which made the case for environmental explanations of the gap. Policy analysts embraced Jenks's analysis and dismissed Jensen's. In any case, everyone knew that results of cognitive tests were irrelevant because the tests were so culturally biased against Africans. As a policy analyst just beginning his career, I shared those positions. In 1977, for example, I was conducting an evaluation of a Chicago program to divert chronic male delinquents from reform schools. I spent a few weeks in the headquarters of the Juvenile Division of the Illinois Department of Corrections in St. Charles, Illinois, laboriously transferring information from each boy's record to my database. Each record included a score on the Stanford Binet IQ test, just 2 or 3 digits to write down. But almost all of the boys were African, so I didn't bother to do it. I knew those numbers were uninterpretable. A few years later, I read Arthur Jensen's Bias in Mental Testing, documenting that the major tests were not biased against minorities. By the time I wrote Losing Ground, published in 1984, I no longer thought that African test scores were uninterpretable, nor was I oblivious to the size of the differences in scores. Much of the chapter about education was devoted to discussing those differences, but I still thought that better education was the answer, whereas I was pessimistic about the potential of federal social programs to do good in most arenas. I thought the one exception was school vouchers, especially for parents who were already actively engaged in overseeing their children's education. I suggest that when we give such parents vouchers, we will observe substantial convergence of black and white test scores in a single generation, I wrote, confident that I was right. During the 1980s, a number of new studies gave reason to think that things were getting better even without a school voucher program. When Richard Herrnstein and I were writing the bell curve in the early 1990s, We included encouraging signs that the European-African test score difference was diminishing, though we were worried about signs that the narrowing had stalled. By the time George W. Bush came to office in 2001, the stalling had continued for more than a decade. The new president, encouraged by his experience with educational reforms in Texas, got the support of Senator Ted Kennedy to pass the bipartisan No Child Left Behind bill, with its goal of bringing all, yes, all, children to proficiency in reading and math by 2014. Progress was to be measured by regular standardized tests, and schools that failed to make progress were subject to penalties. The spotlight was now on K-12 test scores. The difficulties in raising test scores that had been worrying a comparatively few academics now became a topic in the media. In the first half of the 2000s, the public schools were convulsed with efforts to push borderline students over the threshold of proficiency. But the promised rise in African test scores failed to materialize. During the last half of the decade, most schools and the Federal Department of Education alike tacitly admitted defeat. The question of test score differences had gotten more complicated during that decade. It was no longer a story of just African test scores, but Latin and Asian test scores as well. Latins also lagged behind Europeans, though, by less than Africans did. But Asians did better than Europeans. A statement of the current race differences in cognitive ability is correspondingly more complicated. The studies. Hundreds of studies have reported cognitive test scores for different races, but only a comparative handful are relevant to determining the best estimate of mean race differences in cognitive ability in the United States. To qualify for the inventory of studies I assembled, a study had to meet 3 criteria. First, it must have been designed to yield nationally representative results through its sample structure or through weights that could be attached to the participants' scores. Second, the study's cognitive tests must have included measures of both verbal and mathematical or visuospatial skills. Third, the persons in the sample in the study must have reached the onset of adolescence. Operationally, this worked out to samples in which the youngest member was at least 12 years old, with one exception for which a few members of the sample were only 11. The reason for the age restriction is that my objective is to estimate mean race differences among adults. Race differences in cognitive ability increase significantly from infancy to childhood to adulthood for reasons that are disputed but aren't relevant to this book. As an empirical matter, the onset of puberty marks the point at which the size of the difference has stabilized. The tests that meet these criteria are standardizations of the major IQ tests, large federally sponsored studies using cognitive test batteries with good measures of G loaded in the jargon, and the longitudinal assessments of academic achievement known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, pronounced NAEP. I summarize those studies with scatter plots. The online documentation contains downloadable Excel tables with all the data used to create them. IQ standardization samples. When a new edition of an IQ test has been developed, has met the appropriate psychometric standards, and is ready for public use, it is standardized on a sample that can be treated as representative of the national population, so that scores can be normed to the familiar IQ metric based on a mean of 100. The IQ standardizations that have reported results by race, some have not, are those for the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scales, the Woodcock-Johnson tests of cognitive abilities, and the Kaufman Adolescent Adult Intelligence Scale. The strength of the IQ standardization samples is that they represent the best available measures of cognitive ability. If you have reason to evaluate your own profile of mental abilities or that of your child, your best choice by far is one of the major IQ tests individually administered by someone who has been trained for that job. The disadvantage of the standardization samples is that the subsamples of Africans, Latins, and Asians are often small, a few hundred people, and small samples usually mean less reliable group results. Small samples also make subgroup results sensitive to even minor divergences from the sample stratification strategy. I have already mentioned Project Talent from 1960 and the Equal Educational Opportunity Survey from 1965, which resulted in the Coleman Report. NB, a year in this discussion always refers to the year in which the cognitive tests were administered, not the year when results were published. Both studies use test batteries explicitly designed to measure G, and both indicated a European-African difference exceeding 15 IQ points. But they are the only nationally representative results of any kind available for the entire decade, so the scatterplots that follow start at 1970. The two most important of the federally sponsored studies are the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, started in 1979, and the one started in 1997, which are among the most widely used American social science databases. The cognitive tests they employed were administered in 1980 and 1998, respectively. Both studies used the Armed Forces Qualification Test, AFQT, a highly G-loaded test battery. In 1972, the National Center for Education Statistics launched the first in a series of nationally representative longitudinal studies, the National Longitudinal Study of the High School Class of 1972. It was followed by High School and Beyond in 1980, the National Education Longitudinal Study of 1988, the Education Longitudinal Study of 2002, and the High School Longitudinal Study of 2009. The 1988 and 2002 studies used only tests of reading and mathematics and are Class C field with NAEP as achievement tests. The 2009 study administered only a mathematics test and does not qualify for the inventory. The National Assessment of Educational Progress. NAEP is a congressionally mandated program administered by the National Center for Education Statistics. It periodically tests large and nationally representative samples of students in the 4th, 8th, and 12th grades. NAEP's purpose is to measure educational achievement. It has occasionally administered other tests on subjects such as science and civics, but the core NAEP examinations consist of a reading test and a math test. Despite its stated goal of measuring academic achievement, the NAEP reading and math tests are inevitably correlated with G, as are all academic achievement tests. However, academic achievement tests are less complete measures of G than IQ tests. There's more to cognitive ability than reading and math. Add in highly G-loaded tests of related but distinct abilities, and the differences between groups that are revealed are likely to become larger. The implication is that race differences on the NAEP tests, the NELS 88 and the ELS 2002, are probably smaller than they would have been if an IQ-like test battery had been administered. Furthermore, NAEP does not administer both math and reading tests to the same students, so the two scores cannot be combined into a composite score, as is done in the other studies. Rather than engage in the statistical assumptions that would have been necessary to combine the NAEP reading and math scores, I computed the race differences using the known means and standard deviation see below for the reading and math scores separately, and then use the mean of those two differences to represent the race difference. Using the mean of the two scores tends to underestimate the difference as explained in the note. One other wrinkle of the NAEP scores is that the National Center for Education Statistics sponsors two series of tests, the regular NAEP tests, which may be modified from year to year to reflect developments in the high school curriculum, and the tests administered as part of the long-term trend assessment program, designed to be consistent over time. Every NAEP test, whether part of the standard administrations or the long-term trend assessment, consists of a large, nationally representative standalone sample using technically excellent tests of math and reading. If no other issues were involved, I would have included all of the administrations in the analysis, but some had to be omitted for reasons explained in the online documentation. Interpreting the scores. In the pages to come, I refer to cognitive tests that use different scoring systems. There's a way to compare them using means and standard deviations to create what are known as standard scores or Z-scores. They're useful once you become familiar with them, but most readers are more likely to be familiar with IQ scores, so I will use the IQ metric to describe cognitive ability whenever I'm describing means taken from a nationally representative sample. In Chapter 5, when I'm dealing with the unrepresentative samples of students who self-select to take admissions tests for college and professional schools, the SAT, ACT, GRE, MCAT, and LSAT, I use standardized scores. When I refer to mean differences among races, I express the difference in terms of standard deviations, with the abbreviation SD. If that term is new to you, the note gives you a primer. Here are the basics. A standard deviation is a measure of how spread out a set of scores is. In essence, it is the typical difference between the individual numbers in a set and the mean for that set. Z-scores are normed to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. IQ scores are normed to have a population mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Normed means that the raw scores are converted to fit a predetermined mean and standard deviation. This kind of conversion can be done legitimately with any trait that is distributed normally, meaning that the distribution of raw scores approximates a bell curve. As a rough guide to interpreting sizes of differences, think of a difference of half an SD as moderate and a difference of 1 SD as large, to give you some concrete examples. If you have an IQ of 100, you are at the mean of the U.S. national population, the 50th percentile. Doing well in high school is not a problem, and you can flourish in a wide variety of post-secondary technical training programs or get an AA degree. But getting a BA in a traditional liberal arts major is challenging, and a BS in a STEM major, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is probably not in the cards. If you have an IQ of 115, 1 SD above the mean, you are at the 84th percentile of the national population. You can successfully get a degree in most college majors, though maybe not as a STEM major at a tough school. If you have an IQ of 130, 2 SDs above the mean, you are in the 98th percentile. You meet a common definition of gifted. If you have an IQ of 145, 3 SDs above the mean, you are in the top 10th of the top percentile and can probably get a PhD in any discipline that attracts you. If you have reasonable interpersonal skills to go with your cognitive ability, you will be avidly courted by employers. If your skills tilt toward math or programming, many hedge funds and Silicon Valley companies will be indifferent to your interpersonal skills. They'll offer you riches regardless. Expressing comparisons in terms of percentiles can be useful, which is why I sometimes report them. But when the objective is to express differences between groups, percentiles can be misleading because the effective width of a percentile becomes greater as it gets further from the mean. For example, 2 students at the 43 R&D and 56th percentiles of cognitive ability are 13 percentiles apart and about 5 IQ points apart, a difference of 0.33 SDS. Substantively, the difference in cognitive ability between the 2 students is so small that even the most perceptive teachers cannot easily guess which student has which score. Now consider 2 students at the 86.9th and 99.9th percentiles. They too are exactly 13 percentiles apart, but their respective IQs are 117 and 146, a difference of 1.93 SDS. Unless there is a misleading personality factor, a perceptive teacher will know without doubt which student has which score after the first day, perhaps after the first 15 minutes. If you're not convinced, here's another example. A score that puts someone at the 99th percentile is obviously high, and it is natural to think it doesn't make a lot of difference to get more precise. But that's illusory. Every starter on every men's basketball team for every major university in the country is probably in the 99th percentile on a scale of male basketball ability. But that's the same percentile that LeBron James is in. Percentiles are grossly inadequate for conveying differences in performance at the high end. The differences. This section summarizes the results from the assembled inventory of mental test scores, comparing the European means with the African, Latin, and Asian means. I use scatter plots to show you how the differences have changed from 1970 to 2019. The scatter plots use unadorned data, giving you a picture of what happens when race differences in scores from all of the relevant studies are thrown into the pot. When the data are examined analytically, more complicated stories emerge. But those more complicated stories are themselves subject to alternative interpretations. The online documentation provides interested readers with downloadable files containing all the data used to prepare the scatter plots and associated data that enable more complicated analyses. I discuss them in the online documentation. The European-African difference, the race difference in cognitive ability that has caused by far the most controversy and angst since the 1960s, is the difference between America's Africans and Europeans. It also is informed by the most data, 59 estimates, adding up the age breakdowns from the studies in my inventory. The figure below shows how the size of the difference varied from 1972 to 2019. The solid black circles in the plot indicate results from the average of math and reading tests. All but 2 are from NAEP, while the white circles indicate IQ standardizations or G-loaded tests in federal surveys. The figure shows a major reduction in the difference during the 1970s and into the 1980s. Exactly when the narrowing stopped is open to interpretation. Regression analyses show that the trend line was nearly flat for tests conducted from 1983 through 2019. But 1987 saw the lowest mean for any year 0.69 SDS. So I will use 1987 to illustrate the change in the trend lines. You had been analyzing these data near the end of the 1980s and had all the information in the graph through 1987. Looking at the graph, you can visualize a line that characterizes the downward slant of the European-African difference from 1972 to 1987. The statistically best possible straight line is one that minimizes the error over the whole set of observations, even though the line seldom passes through the exact value of any given observation. The best line for the European-African difference is represented by the downward-sloping gray line. Its values for 1972 and 1987 are 1.33 SDs and 0.87 SDs, respectively, representing a reduction of a third from the 1972 difference. You would have had excellent reason for optimism. As the dotted extension of the line shows, the European-African gap in test scores would have gone to 0 by 2015 if that trend had continued. But it did not. The nearly flat gray line represents the trend from 1987 through 2019. A more optimistic story emerges when the test results are analyzed separately by program. For example, both sets of NAEP administrations show a declining European to African difference from the late 1990s through the most recent administrations. On the other hand, the NAEP reductions come after the increases in the early 1990s. So the net differences are larger for both 8th graders and 12th graders than they were at their low point in the late 1980s. I hope to deflect potential debates about trends over time by using an estimate of the current difference that is conservative in 2 respects. First, the estimate is based on tests administered from 2010 to 2019, when European-African differences have been at their smallest since the late 1980s. Second, 9 of the 10 tests during that period are academic achievement tests, meaning that 9 of 10 measures tend to understate differences in G that would be revealed by full-scale cognitive test batteries. The mean of the 10 measures of the European-African estimate works out to 0.85 SDS. The European-Latin difference. The European-Latin difference in mental test scores is consistently smaller than the European-African difference, but it remains substantial. I have drawn a linear trend line to help organize your view of the history, but obviously the story is more complicated than that. Notably, the difference increased during the 1990s, then resumed its decline in the early 2000s. The fitted values for the European-Latin difference in 1972 and 2019 are 0.87 SDs and 0.63 SDS respectively, a reduction of 28%. The decline shows no signs of ending. I have no satisfactory explanation for the rise in the difference during the 1990s. A close examination of changes in the nature of the Latin immigrant pool over that period might give some clues. The mean difference in the 11 test results during the 2010s is 0.6% to SDS, and that will serve as my estimate of the current European-Latin difference. When Richard Herrnstein and I were writing the bell curve in the early 1990s, our assessment was that Asians had a higher mean IQ than Europeans. But the fragmentary data then available made that conclusion quite tentative. By now, the evidence has piled up and is conclusive. On average, Asians outscore Europeans, Africans, and Latins. This graph has something new: negative values on the vertical axis, which are needed to show when Asians have a higher mean test score than Europeans. The farther below 0, the larger the Asian advantage. The generally small but irregular European-Asian difference into the 1990s is typical of the spread of results when sample sizes are small, as they were for some of those tests. But a more important explanation, albeit speculative, is that large-scale Asian immigration began in the 1970s, with large numbers of Vietnamese refugees whose children were still being acculturated to America and used English as their second language when they took the NAEP in the 1980s. Subsequent Asian immigration has drawn heavily from highly educated East Asians and South Asians. The more consistent results from the mid-1990s onward could reflect a more consistently talented immigrant pool. The trendline is based on 1995 to 2019, when the fitted values of the European-Asian difference went from 0.09 SDS to 0.39 SDS, a remarkable net change of nearly half a standard deviation in 24 years. The estimate of the current European-Asian difference, like the others, uses tests from the 2010s, which averaged 0.30 SDS, using tests administered during the 2010s, which in effect means NAEP. The mean European-African difference was 0.85 SDS, the mean European-Latin difference was 0.6% SDS, and the mean European-Asian difference was 0.30 SDS. Assuming a mean of 100 and SD of 15 for IQ, the corresponding equivalents in IQ points are 12.75, 9.30, and 4.50 respectively. My estimate of European IQ is the mean of the 4 IQ standardizations from the 2000s, which works out to 103.35. Thus, we are left with mean IQ estimates of 90.6000 for Africans, 94.05 for Latins, and 107.85 for Asians. Rounding estimated IQ to the nearest whole number, here are the means and their percentiles in the national distribution that I will use for the rest of the book. For all three minorities, we should expect that disaggregation into subgroups would produce different estimates. It would be useful to have separate measures for Africans who remained in the rural South, recent African immigrants, and all other Africans, separate measures for European Latins, Mestizo Latins, and Indigenous Latins, and separate measures for East Asians, Southeast Asians, and South Asians. But the data for making good estimates don't exist. What do these estimates of current race differences mean for daily life where you live? Probably not much. Maybe you work in a big city where the means are reasonably close to those in the table above, while the means in the suburb where you live are radically different. Maybe you live in a small town with only a few minority families. They have no significant group mean. They are just individuals. Maybe you live in a college town where the means around campus are very different from those in the surrounding community. The information about race differences in mean cognitive ability is useful only as background information for thinking about issues at a societal level. The figure below shows the distributions of cognitive ability for the 4 races from 2 perspectives. The top figure shows how much overlap exists in the distributions. It is not a threatening picture. Yes, differences exist, but it is also true that millions of Africans and Latins have higher cognitive ability than millions of Europeans and Asians. The top figure should also serve as an object lesson in the necessity of judging people as individuals, not members of groups. If you rely on the difference, it means you are going to make a huge number of mistakes about individuals. The bottom figure shows why race differences in cognitive ability nonetheless have consequences for the society as a whole. The differences in the raw numbers of individuals on the right-hand side of the bell curve become larger as IQ goes up. Among people of the 4 races with IQs of 100, 70% are European or Asian. For IQs of 115, 85%. For IQs of 125, 90%. For IQs of 140, 96%. Since the most prestigious, powerful, and highest-paying jobs are so concentrated among people on the right-hand side of the distribution, a variety of important social and economic consequences are not just possible. They are inevitable. Chapter 5 takes up a few of the most important ones. Are race differences in test scores meaningful? It is time to confront the issue that will have led many readers to discount everything that has come before in this chapter. How can we expect that an African or Latin child growing up in poverty, going to terrible schools, and victimized by systemic racism will score well on tests designed by white people to measure things that white people have decided are important? That reaction and its variations often conflate 2 positions. The first is the one I held when I was writing Losing Ground. which was that meaningful differences exist, but we know how to shrink them. It's just a matter of implementing solutions that will make the remaining differences too small to worry about. The other position, and one that I'm sure many readers hold, is that the tests don't measure African and Latin cognitive ability accurately. They are biased in favor of Europeans and Asians, and biased against Africans and Latins. We know how to fix it. Regarding the first position, that improved education, especially early education, will reduce race differences, I could lay out what we know about the malleability of cognitive ability, the record on interventions intended to raise cognitive ability, and the persistence of race differences in mean test scores, even among children from socioeconomically privileged families. I have written about such issues at length elsewhere. The short story is that ordinary exposure to education does indeed have an effect on cognitive ability for all children, but that no one has yet found a way to increase cognitive ability permanently over and above the effects of routine education. The success stories consist of modest effects on exit tests that fade out. Most experimental programs don't achieve even that much. We know how to improve education for children at every cognitive level, but we don't know how to change their cognitive levels. The NAEP results give us a simpler way to think about the intractability of the problem. The mean differences separating European teenagers from African teenagers in math and reading haven't diminished since the last half of the 1980s. That's more than 3 decades during which hundreds of billions of dollars have been poured into attempts to improve the education of disadvantaged children, including the intense effort to reduce test score differences through No Child Left Behind. To dismiss the differences in mean test scores that I have described as a problem that we know how to fix if we try hard enough is a triumph of hope over a very great deal of experience. The tests are biased. Now we come to a position that is taken for granted by much of the public, but has nearly disappeared in technical literature of this century because there are so few unresolved questions. The accusations of test bias take many forms. The most common is probably the assumption that a person from a poor and marginalized community won't be able to answer many of the questions because the answers depend on knowledge or vocabulary to which they have not been exposed. Other issues include whether African and Latin youngsters are as motivated to perform well on tests, and the assumption that test scores are sensitive to the amount of test prep that a student gets. Perhaps the tests don't measure the same construct in people of different races. For example, an IQ test might measure cognitive ability in Europeans, but it's actually measuring socioeconomic status in Africans. All of these possibilities have been investigated minutely, but all of them are ancillary to the central practical question about bias in mental tests. Do the test results underpredict the performance of minorities in real-life situations? Tests of cognitive ability have value because they help in predicting things that people want to know about. Admissions committees for college want to know how an applicant is likely to do in college. Employers want to know how well an applicant is likely to perform on the job. Whatever the combination of sources of test bias might be, genuine bias against a minority will show up in a way that leaves no room for doubt. It will underpredict the test taker's performance in the classroom or on the job. Whether predictive validity is the same for different groups can be subjected to rigorous statistical scrutiny, and it has been, repeatedly. 14. The results are unambiguous, whether the thing being predicted is grades in school or performance on the job. The major tests do not underpredict the performance of Africans or Latins. Just because a test doesn't underpredict minority performance doesn't exclude the possibility of other problems. Suppose, for example, that the test overpredicts African classroom performance, a phenomenon that has often been found for tests of academic aptitude. In such cases, the SAT or ACT scores predict that Africans will have better grades and graduation rates than they actually achieve. This could be explained by everything from cultural differences in ways that students approach homework to racist teachers giving African students low marks. But none of the potential explanations support the proposition that the test is biased against Africans. You may still be unsatisfied. The statistical evidence doesn't lend itself to straightforward tables or graphs. I can, however, give you some concrete evidence of how solid the professional consensus is. In 1995, in the wake of the controversy over the bell curve, The American Psychological Association established a task force of 11 of the nation's most eminent scholars of cognitive ability. They represented a wide range of theoretical perspectives. The disagreements that those 11 had among themselves about cognitive ability and testing were many and deep. Their assignment was to prepare a summary of the state of knowledge regarding the measurement of intelligence that all of them could agree on. They did so, unanimously signing off on their report, with no minority dissents. The following is the entirety of what the task force wrote about test bias. It is often argued that the lower mean scores of African Americans reflect a bias in the intelligence tests themselves. This argument is right in one sense of bias but wrong in another. To see the first of these, consider how the term is used in probability theory. When a coin comes up heads consistently for any reason, it is said to be biased, regardless of any consequences that the outcome may or may not have. In this sense, the black-white score differential is ipso facto evidence of what may be called outcome bias. African Americans are subject to outcome bias not only with respect to tests but along many dimensions of American life. They have the short end of nearly every stick: average income, representation in high-level occupations, health and healthcare, death rate, confrontations with the legal system, and so on. With this situation in mind, some critics regard the test score differential as just another example of a pervasive outcome bias that characterizes our society as a whole. Although there is a sense in which they are right, this critique ignores the particular social purpose that tests are designed to serve. From an educational point of view, the chief function of mental tests is as predictors. Intelligence tests predict school performance fairly well, at least in American schools as they are now constituted. Similarly, achievement tests are fairly good predictors of performance in college and postgraduate settings. Considered in this light, the relevant question is whether the tests have a predictive bias against blacks. Such a bias would exist if African American performance on the criterion variables, school achievement, college GPA, etc., were systematically higher than the same subject's test scores would predict. This is not the case. The actual regression lines which show the mean criterion performance for individuals who got various scores on the predictor for blacks do not lie above those for whites. There is even a slight tendency in the other direction. Considered as predictors of future performance, the tests do not seem to be biased against African Americans. The language of testing is a standard form of English with which some blacks may not be familiar. Specific vocabulary items are often unfamiliar to black children. The tests are often given by white examiners rather than by more familiar black teachers. African Americans may not be motivated to work hard on tests that so clearly reflect white values. The time demands of some tests may be alien to black culture. Similar suggestions have been made in connection with the test performance of Hispanic Americans. Many of these suggestions are plausible, and such mechanisms may play a role in particular cases. Controlled studies have shown, however, that none of them contribute substantially to the black-white differential under discussion here. Nothing in the literature in the 26 years since the task force issued its report has successfully challenged these findings. If this is still too obscure to be persuasive, there's an easier way to think about whether tests are biased against Africans and Latins. It's not just psychometricians who analyze these things. All the top colleges have quantified expectations of the students that they accept. They keep track of how students perform relative to those expectations. If any of these colleges had any evidence whatsoever that their African or Latin students outperform the expectations based on their SAT or ACT scores, they would have publicized it in every way possible as evidence of excellence in educating minorities. You may know inspiring true stories about individual African or Latin students who have done well in college despite disadvantages they had to overcome. But you won't have seen such stories about African or Latin students as a group. Many African and Latin students are admitted to selective colleges with low test scores. College administrators would be ecstatic if those low scores turned out to be illusory for those students as a group. They aren't. That's what lies behind the bloodless finding in the technical literature that the predictive validity of test scores is the same for different races. If it weren't true, you would have heard about it long ago. The movement to get colleges to stop using the SAT, ACT, and GRE is gaining ground. There are serious arguments for dropping the tests that don't rely on accusations of test bias. My own view is that the goals of the SAT could be met with achievement tests that don't carry the controversies associated with test bias and the rumored magic of test prep. To prepare for an achievement test in chemistry, you don't need to learn test-taking tricks. You just need to study chemistry. Such arguments are not driving the movement to get rid of the tests, however. The activists say that the tests are worthless, products of white privilege, designed to perpetuate white privilege. In their minds, they don't need evidence of bias. The existence of lower mean scores for Africans and Latins is in itself irrefutable evidence of bias, because everyone knows there are no race differences in intelligence. This is argued with all the passion and conviction that true believers bring to their evangelism. It does not reflect